All right, the hourglass is turned. Welcome everyone. My name is Øyvind Kallstad, and I'm going to talk about using PowerShell together with other languages. The title that I chose was using other languages from PowerShell, but in retrospect, I think perhaps using other languages with PowerShell would have been a better title. So this is just a quote that I found on the internet about heterogeneous environments, which is pretty much the reason why I chose to have this talk. In the real world, when you're out at customers and working with big enterprise systems, it's quite rare to find a totally homogeneous environment. And even though we mainly do PowerShell, work in PowerShell, and use PowerShell modules and PowerShell scripts, you're bound to stumble upon scripts written in other languages, and you might perhaps have a need to call those scripts from your scripts, or vice versa. So that's kind of the topic of this talk today. So a little bit about the agenda, what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show you on the Windows side. I'm going to talk about how to call native applications from PowerShell, and also show you some example of scripts written in other languages and how to call them from PowerShell. We're going to look at the Windows Subsystem for Linux and see how we can run commands directly into the subsystem. We're going to look at running C# code from within PowerShell, and also the other way around, running PowerShell code from within C#. And then we have some Linux-specific stuff that we want to cover, how to run Windows Executables from within the subsystem for Linux, how we would go about calling PowerShell scripts, PowerShell core scripts from Linux, and then how we would call Linux scripts from PowerShell core on Linux, or native commands. So it's going to be quite a lot of small demos. So please feel free to just raise your hand and ask me questions while I'm doing them. All right. Oh. Yep, there we are. Okay, how's the size from the back there? Should I? Is that enough? All right, let's try that. So, let's see. Okay, so the first part that we want to cover is running native commands from PowerShell, either in scripts or just from the command line. The first thing that you want to be aware of when you're doing that is, firstly, that PowerShell does a quite good job of actually letting you run native commands. And since you're on Windows, that is, the old DOS commands. But be aware of aliases. So if you have an alias with the same name as a native command, you might not get the result that you expect. So that's something to keep in mind. For instance, dir is an alias for get child item, and so you wouldn't get the DOS version of dir when you run it. So stuff like that is something to be aware of. Usually when you have some native command that you want to run, as long as it's in the path, you're pretty much good to go, because it means you can just run it. But of course, if the command is not in the path, you will need to reference the full path of the executable. In the following examples, I'm using Ssh-Keygen to generate an SSH key. It's a command that's included in the Git for Windows package. So usually most of the problems that you will stumble upon when you're running native commands is in the parameter part, when you want to give your parameters into the command. So so this is typically something you would like to do, right? You would like to call the command, you give it parameters, and hopefully you will not store your password in clear text as I did here, but this is just an example. But you will most likely have it in a variable that you want to give to the parameter. So, as you might expect, the first demo fails. Wouldn't be any fun otherwise. So this is the case of the executable not being in the path. So I have to reference the full path to the executable. So that means that we try to do something like this. We just store the path in a variable, and then we try again. Still no luck. So what we can do then, we have some options, and I think an important one is to know about the call operator, which is this one. I don't know if you can actually see the highlight on the screen, but it's the and character. So we use that to call up the command that's in the variable. And now you see that it's actually starting and running the command as we would expect. So I will already run this, so I don't need to create. Oh, I was in the wrong window. Yeah. So, and something that you will often, or sometimes it all depends on the implementation of the command that you're using. You might turn into some troubles where you need to escape some characters. And in this case, you couldn't see this here because I didn't actually run the command, but I don't think it actually unpacked correctly the variable. And in this particular case, and for the Ssh-Keygen, it's kind of weird because most parameters behave the way you would expect, except the -n command, which takes the password, and then you have to do some funky stuff with escaping to actually get it to unroll the variable. But that's particular to this command.
What are you're escaping the double quotes?
Yes. So yeah. So it actually expects a string in the format of double quotes, string, double quotes. But double quotes alone in PowerShell is removed, right, when you roll it. So that's why I had to escape those. And likewise, just as a bonus tip, this is how you would write it if you want to give it an empty passphrase. So yeah, that's just. I also wanted to mention that if the executable is in a path without any spaces or any special characters, you can just reference it directly like this, so you wouldn't need to have it in a variable or in quotation marks or anything. And then it actually should run. It didn't. Yeah, okay, yeah, it's the problem with this one again. So what we can do then is to use the stop parsing operator. This guy, I don't know how many people know about this and have used this before. Okay, a few of you. So basically, this one is really handy because it tells PowerShell to just at this point just stop parsing whatever comes next until the next line. And that's really handy when you're working with stuff like this, because then it just takes everything coming after at face value. Of course, the problem arises if you have, for instance, a password or something that you have in a variable, then that will not be passed and not will be opened and unrolled. So that means that we can run that. And now it's working. Again, I'm not going to actually run it. So then you can, of course, combine the two using the call operator if you have the path in the variable. And at some point, you can just use the stop parsing operator. And this is the example I told you where it actually wouldn't work because this one will not be sent. The value of that variable will not be sent to that parameter. So it will send $PW. So that will fail. Often I see, and I've done that myself many times, that I try to do something like this. I save the path in a variable, and I save all my parameter values beforehand like this, and you would think that would work, right? It would be nice if it would, but that doesn't work. So what actually happens here is that it reads the first parameter, and all the rest is actually trying to be sent as part of that parameter's value. So this is another variant where you can. It's quite handy to use the stop parsing. So you can, if you know that you want to have you don't need any variables or anything, you can just put it after all the parameters where you have values, and that will also work quite well. So I'm just going to skip a little bit of this stuff so that we get through. Right, so this is just an example using one particular native command, and they might vary in the kind of problems you would come into. So you'd need to just try it out and see what method works. Just be aware of that. Sometimes it can be a bit tricky to get the parameters if they are complex and if they have a lot of special characters and they need strings with quotation marks and stuff like that. So that's native commands. So let's take a look at some other languages. Another quite popular language is Python. How many here use Python? Oh, yeah, there's quite a few of you. So it's not unreasonable to think that you would like to call a Python script from a PowerShell script. And I'm by no means a professional Python developer or anything, but so if you know Python, you will probably wrinkle your nose at my code. But it's just an example of how you can do it. So I'm just going to open the first script here, which is this one. Yeah. So this is really the simplest script you can make. It's just a hello world script, and it's pretty much how you would expect it to work. You you call the Python executable and you give it the script path, really, and it will just start. And of course, here's the same problem arises if you don't have Python in your path environment variable. You would need to either add it or reference the full path. So let's run this. And I would just call the hello Python script from PowerShell. And likewise, if you have a script that takes parameters, you just, in this case, you just tack on the parameters, after the script path itself. And this is just a simple Python script that just sums two integers. There you go.
And what is the return? Always strings?
Well, that depends on the Python script, right? So, yeah. And now, let's move on. Take a look at... oh, sorry, I wasn't quite done, actually. I had one more example. Node scripts. Usually when you have, if you want to call PowerShell scripts or PowerShell commands from other languages, the method is pretty much the same, really. You just call the executable and give it, the script name. But in Node, I think I actually hold on to that one. I'm going to get back to this Node one. I'll take it out afterwards. I just want to do the subsystem one first. So when you install Subsystem for Linux, if you install Ubuntu, for instance, you can run commands within the subsystem like this. And you notice that nothing really was returned, which is kind of odd. I mean, if you go into Ubuntu and do the same thing, you get hello world, right? So what's going on? Perhaps we should try to pack the whole command in quotation marks instead. Well, still some weirdness going on there. So this is the case of using the correct quotation marks, really. So Linux is similar in PowerShell in the way that when you use double quotation marks, it actually unrolls variables and commands, while single quotation marks do not. So we have to switch it around like this to get it to actually run the command. So now we sent in the command echo hello world into bash from PowerShell. So let me see if we have the commando. Yeah. So now instead of just calling a command, I'm calling a bash script from PowerShell within Windows Subsystem for Linux. And it says command not found, which is odd, because I know that the file is there. So this is, we can actually test that by sending in an ls. So if you see here, the script is there. And this one shouldn't really come as a big surprise for PowerShell people, because as in PowerShell, you have to tell it where the file is. And if you want to tell it it's in the current position, you use a dot and a slash. So the only thing you have to remember is that in Linux, there is a / instead of the backslash. So by using this, it works as expected. We call our bash script running in Windows Subsystem for Linux from PowerShell. And if you want to send arguments to a bash script, you have to wrap it in quotation marks. So this is how we would do that. You would say hello world from WSL, that's the correct output, but if I didn't do it, the parameter itself is not sent into the script. And there's also one kind of major gotcha when you're working with cross-platform stuff like this. I have another script here called hello3. And it runs, but it gives me this weird error at the beginning that it can't find $/R. And this is because on Linux and Windows, they use different line endings in the script file. So I created this script on a Windows machine. And since Windows uses a different type of line endings, you get this error message. So I can just quickly open the script and show you how easy it is to change this. So at least in Visual Studio Code, if you go down here, you see CRLF, that's the Windows, the line endings that the Windows wants. But if you just click it, you can change it to LF. So when you write bash scripts, you have to you change the line ending so that's correct. All right. Any questions on so far? Nope. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, so just be aware of if I just use the command bash now to run stuff inside it, but of course now you have multiple distros that you can actually run simultaneously. So I have the Ubuntu one installed, and I can also call it with the keyword Ubuntu instead. So that's just something to be aware of. And of course you can run native Linux commands as well. So for instance, the top command, which
From where can you call it? From a standard 5.1 PowerShell?
yeah. As long as the subsystem executable is in the path, you can use regular DOS prompt if you want to. So this one is quite nice, or at least it looks kind of cool. So this is the top command that you love if you use Linux. Oh, come on. Yeah, I do, but there we go. Just a bit sluggish. Thanks. And of course, you can use it to connect to a server using SSH, like this. So, of course, I don't really have access to that server. It's just an example. So if you really need SSH and don't have any other way of doing it and are able to run Subsystem for Linux, you can use it for that. And if you want to, you can write a little wrapper function like I did here, just called SSH, and then you have SSH that you can run from Windows. Of course, the only problem here is that if you need SSH keys and stuff like that, those have to exist within the subsystem for Linux and not in a Windows machine, unless you change the SSH config to a folder in the /mnt/c folder inside there. So it's possible. Now some quick demos of running C# code from PowerShell. So there's two ways of doing that. You could either separate the C# code in separate files, or you can have it inline in your code. So I'm still at the right direction. Yeah. So I have this. It's the first method. I'm referencing a Hello World program in C# that I created. This is really top-notch programming, by the way. So, oh, this was not correct. There we are. So you would use the add type commandlet, which have a path parameter. Just give it the path of the file. And now in that file, I created the namespace, my namespace, and I have a class called hello with a static method, say hello, which I can reference like this, like we did other .NET static methods. And I get my code executed, hello world. If you do it inline, you could do it a little bit differently. So here I get away with just declaring my static method. And in add type, you could declare the namespace and the name and stuff like that directly in the command. And you reference the inline code in the member definition parameter. So just do like this, and we add the type, and then it's the same thing as the last example. Just reference it like this to call our code. I was actually going to skip the next part, but listening to Staffan's demo and saw some code that he had, I decided to actually try to see if I could get PowerShell commands to run within a compiled C# application, which I haven't really done before, and it works. So I decided to include it here. So again, it's yeah, I can show you the code, which should be here somewhere. So this is a little more involved than the last examples. So basically, the first thing you have to do is you have to in Visual Studio you have to add the reference to the system management automation assembly, and you can do that by using the NuGet library. Just search for PowerShell or system automation, management automation. And this is, I think, the easiest way I managed to actually create a simple hello world. It's probably not, or I know it's not best practice because I'm not handling any errors or anything. But basically, I'm just creating another PowerShell session, and then I get a bunch of methods that lets me add commands and parameters to those commands and stuff like that. So as you see, I just use my PowerShell reference here, add command, write output, add parameter, and I just give it a string. And I have to capture the output somehow, and use that, use a PS object for that. And lastly, use the invoke method to actually run the commands within that PowerShell. And since this is a collection, I just loop through and write it out. And since this is an executable, I should have so this is an executable that I compiled from that code. There you go, hello world from C#. So it worked.
Could you come up with a practical application for this, or mostly for fun?
Binary modules. That's probably the most practical use of it. So it's the same basic principles, but of course you have to do a lot more because you have to declare, you know, the parameter sets and parameter names and, you know, stuff like that. But you know, at the core of it, it's something you would do like this. All right. Any questions before we move on? Nope. Okay. So, yeah, and now I think would be a good time to go back to the node example. This was also an example that I really didn't want to include because I thought it would be just an example of, you know, spawning a new shell process and call the executable PowerShell and run some code. So this shows you how you would run PowerShell code from within a Node.js script. And then I noticed that on the Npm, which is you know, kind of the most famous or best packet management system for Node.js, someone had created a Node-PowerShell package. And I got curious and I wanted to test it out, and it worked pretty well. So I included it just to show you. So I can show you the code first. I can set it up first. So when you do, how many people here know Node.js? Yeah, a few of you. So basically, when you start a new Node project, you go into the folder and you have npm is the command you use, and the first thing you do is run npm init, which sets up a new project. Just quickly going to do that now. And it's kind of a wizard that asks you a few simple questions. So a name, and I'll just say hello. And you can define the version, the description, entry point. This one is where you define, you know, the entry point into your program or application. So this, in our case, would be the script I want to run. You can also define test scripts in here if you want to. Git repository. But all this can be added in later, so it's no worries just clicking through them, which I'm doing now. This creates a package.json file, which describes the project and dependencies and version numbers. So this is where you would add in that information later. I keep forgetting to double click. There we go. So the next thing is to download from npm the node PowerShell. I is shorthand for install, and S to save, which means that it will automatically update the package JSON file with a dependency on this package.
It's different from your example.
What did I do?
It's a dash in front of the I.
Oh, thank you. That's probably why it didn't work. So it's now getting the package. And while working with Node, it's worth investing in a git ignore file in your project and just exclude the node_modules folder, because that tends to be quite big and you don't really want to send that back and forth to Git. So now you can see that you actually have a dependency on node PowerShell and the version number. But that's kind of beside the point. I just wanted to show you how easy it was to set up. I can just call it by using Node and the script, which is JavaScript. There you go. It spawns a new process, gives me the output of a command, and then closes the process again. So it's if you want to look at it, it looks kind of like this. I'm not going to go into depth on there. If you're really interested in this, you can download the slides and codes after the conference and take a look at it. Or I referenced the URL where the package is, so you can check it out yourself if you want to do this kind of thing. All right, so that was most of the Windows part of the demos. Am I going too quick, or is it okay? Yeah? Where are you? Everyone is just waiting for lunch. I'll try to finish fast. All right, so now we are going to look at how we can run Windows Executables from within the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So again, it's kind of obvious and simple when you think about it. For instance, this is how I would start Notepad from within the subsystem. What's important to note about Windows Subsystem for Linux is that you have access to the file system from /mnt. And you can see that there's my C and my D. And that's just folders. So I can just go into C, and then you would see my my regular file system. So then I can just reference it on this path, and it would start Notepad from Windows, but in Windows, but from Windows Subsystem for Linux. This one is quite handy if you have a script that you want to open in code while you're working in Ubuntu. So you just reference the executable, but again, just be aware that since you have space in the path here, you have to enclose it in quotation marks. We do the -n, and this will probably not work because I'm not in the correct folder. And also Linux is case sensitive, so that's something to be aware of. Just quickly going to. So if I do this, then I start open the file in code on Windows from Linux. And likewise, you could call the PowerShell executable on Windows PowerShell, and run scripts. So it works exactly the same as you are used to. It's just that you need to of course, reference the executable with the full path. But inside the subsystem for Linux, the full path is, of course, /mnt/c, and then going forward.
What context are you running in when you do this? It still just spawns on the Windows context?
Yeah, it's its own context, isn't it? When you start the subsystem for Windows. So it's normally, if you just start it from the command line, it starts in a user-like context, but you got your own username set up when you install it the first time. So it's you have to authenticate in when you want to do elevated stuff within it, for instance.
So it's running with the user
Yeah.
Linux is running.
So this one would then just call the Windows PowerShell executable and use the -file parameter to call a script. Which again, hello world. Not very exciting, sorry about that. And likewise, you could do the same thing with Windows Core, no, PowerShell Core, but on Windows, which works exactly the same way. And of course, I did some playing around while I was doing this, and I thought I'd see if I can replicate it. It tends to be kind of buggy. I'm trying to do some inception stuff. So I'm starting with a clean, well, it doesn't have to be clean, but I just started Windows Subsystem for Linux, so I'm in Ubuntu now. And I can prove that by checking out this file called OS release, where you get information about the kernel and the version and everything. And then I can actually, I've installed PowerShell Core in Subsystem for Linux, which means I can just start it by pwsh. So now I'm running PowerShell on Windows Subsystem for Linux on Windows 10. There you go. But I didn't stop there. I started Windows PowerShell from within PowerShell Core, from within Windows Subsystem for Linux on Windows 10. So let's see how that works. There you go. PS version table 5.1. So let's see if we can take it even deeper. So let's start good old cmd.exe. There you go. So now we're running cmd within PowerShell for Windows, within PowerShell Core, within Windows Subsystem for Linux on a Windows 10 machine. And we can keep going if we want to, but at this point it gets quite unstable, so I wouldn't really want to do...
Can we go into Bash again?
That's really interesting, but I don't know if I dare. We'll probably...
Say WSL and then the command.
Yeah, but if I just want to open up the shell itself, another BSL or Bash,
Ubuntu, what happens?
but the executable is
WSL. We say WSL PS.
like this.
That's the answer.
Okay. It's a shame though. It would have been fun. But it kind of works, you know. It's yeah, I can't stop this command, and yeah, now things are, yeah, it gets kind of weird. but it works. Proof of concept. I wouldn't rely on it on a production system, though. All right. And then, of course, we have the other way around. You're working on Linux in PowerShell core. So, of course, same thing there. You might want to call your own scripts, of course. That's one thing, but also Bash scripts or Python scripts or native commands and stuff like that. So we're going to look at that. So, just going to start another Ubuntu session here. There we go. So this, right now, I'm just in Ubuntu, or in Bash, really. So if I just want to call a PowerShell script without actually, going into PowerShell, I can do the same thing that you normally would do if you were on Windows. You just reference the executable. And in this case, I'm just giving it, the no profile, no logo, and a file, and reference a file, and it will, run just a script. And it would work as expected. Hello world. That's one way of doing it. Alternatively, you could just skip all the fluff and just do pwsh and then reference the script directly, which works not equally well.
I said it twice.
Okay. There you go. Thank you. So it did work. And there's this concept of what in the Linux world they call the shebang, or however you want to pronounce it. And usually in scripts on Linux, it's usual to right at the beginning of the script, you would define, okay, what kind of shell or interpreter are this script meant for. And that tells, so Linux will then usually read this and send it to whatever you define there. So this actually works with PowerShell scripts as well. So this is a PowerShell script, as you can see, but I've added the shebang, which tells it the binary to run the script, which is /user/bin/pwsh. And this is something that Linux guys take for granted when they write bash scripts and stuff like that. But it's quite nice to know that it actually works exactly the same for PowerShell core on Linux. And that means that I can just reference it like this, the script directly. I don't have to call the PowerShell executable or anything because it's the information it's already. There's something wrong with the paste stuff here. It's pasting double. There you go. So that's probably the easiest. But then of course you have to remember to add in the shebang.
There's no problem having that on Windows, I guess.
I haven't actually tried that, but we can try run it from. Yeah, it shouldn't be a problem though, because it's. There we go. Yeah, works as expected. So yes, that's different ways you would call PowerShell scripts from Linux. And then of course we have the other way around, calling native commands and shell scripts, Linux scripts from within PowerShell core on Linux. And likewise, if you use the shebang, I have here you see it typically if it's a bash script, we just start with this one, which tells Linux that this is something that bash should handle. And then we just This one was not correct. Just call it directly, and then runs the script. And of course, same thing with parameters. There's something wrong with pasting. There you go. This time, since we are in Linux, we don't need to worry about quotation marks and stuff to get the parameters into the script. But of course, you have the same problem with line endings. So if you try to run a script, a bash script, for instance, in this case, that is written on Windows, you would get this weird command until you change that. Another way of doing it is, of course, to reference the executable directly before you run the script, like this. That would also work. And for stuff like Python, it also works exactly the same as you would expect it to work and how it works on Windows. So I don't need to go through them because the output is just the same as we saw. And I have a little gotcha that I noticed while I was doing testing on Windows Core on Linux, and it's how if you use star to shorten file names or to represent missing characters in a file or a path, and if that file is hidden, if you know on Linux, if you start a file name with dot, then it's automatically a hidden file. So in this case, if I want to grep for the word PowerShell in all files that starts with test. Will be something like this. And now we don't have any tests. That's because I have to go into my root folder, my home folder. There you go. So now I have a test file, and now I'm just printing out just the line that includes the phrase PowerShell. And if I had multiple test files, test 1, test 2, test 3, it would just go through all of them because I used the star. But I also have a hidden file called .test. It's actually, if you look at it, they are called test1 and .test2. So if I do grep on the .test star, remember this is on Linux, or in bash rather, it would do the same thing as you would expect. But on the other hand, if you are in Windows PowerShell Core, the first version was exactly as expected, but if you try to do it on the hidden file, you can't find it.
If you specify the full name, though, it will.
Yeah, and all.
We don't do that.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And also what you could do, of course, instead is, because that's something to keep in mind, in Windows PowerShell Core on Linux, ls is not an alias for get child item anymore. It's the native ls command. So you could use get child item instead to get the file and then pipe it into to grep.
Get child item dashboard.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get but just something to be aware of. Again, this with the aliases that I mentioned in the beginning. There are differences there in Linux and Windows. So that's something that you need to be aware of. So yeah, so this is how you would do it. Instead, get content and then dash force, and you would pipe it into grep, and it will work. Oh, yeah, weird. All right, so I think that was the last of those. Any questions on the demos before I move on? Was it overload or too simple? Just a few honorable mentions. I just did a quick search. Usually when you want to run PowerShell stuff from other languages, as I mentioned, you would just spawn a new process called executable and give it its arguments. But there are, for the Go language, there's actually a separate package called Go PowerShell. I just want to mention it here. I don't know how well you can actually see the link on the screen, but you get it in the slides if you want to test it out. And the same for Java. It's called J PowerShell. So just wanted to mention those, that there's those options if you write Go or Java. Any more questions? Yep.
What about reading the outputs, the command of the native command you run in PowerShell?
About using.
You want to get the outputs of, for example, a git command. You want to store this output in a variable.
Yes. So the question is, do you want how to capture the output of native Linux commands from PowerShell core? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. It's you are in PowerShell and it works exactly the same as calling native commands on Windows PowerShell. So you can just assign it to a variable, run the command, and it will capture the output as long as it writes to the standard out stream. Yep. Any more questions? Oh. Then next stop is lunch. So that's something to celebrate, isn't it? If you want to contact me, I can be contacted there. Thank you very much.